I want to be at the first point of entry so we can give these guys the best possible head start so that in 4 or 5 years' time, the coach that gets them goes, wow, you've already got such an awesome skill base. You understand how to move well. We don't have to worry about teaching you. We can just train now.
Hmm.
And I see that in the athletes that we coach when they graduate to other programs, they are far ahead of athletes who've been coached by suboptimal coaches who just focused on getting really strong in a back squat, for example, but didn't bother to develop other movement skills.
Hmm.
And so now our athletes can take their toolbox wherever they go because I don't know what the next coach is going to want.
Welcome to the Athletic Edge podcast. I'm your host, Liam Evans, strength and conditioning coach and owner of Evans Performance. This is a podcast tailored for athletes, coaches, and parents interested in every facet of athletic development. Join me and guests from around the world as we dive into game-changing tools and expert insights covering strength training, performance enhancement, and long-term athletic development strategies. Uncover the keys to elevate your athletic potential, drawing from trusted resources to safely and effectively navigate your training and build your athletic edge. Welcome back to the podcast. So on today's episode, we're very lucky to be joined by Rob Anderson. Rob is the owner of Athletic Evolution, which is essentially a strength and conditioning business in Scotland focused on youth athletic development. He's been involved in the field for a very long time, has a lot of great experience that he can share with us. Before we get to any of the nitty gritty, I'd love for you to just tell the people a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, so pretty varied background. I was born in London, but grew up in Australia. So I grew up in quite a big outdoors culture, surrounded by Australian rules football and basketball and cricket, but found myself playing football or soccer, as they would have called it there, which at that point in time was still quite a minority sport. Loved that, wanted to pursue that. I moved back to the UK, where we were originally from. Wasn't good enough to play professionally and kind of went down the route of like, what's the next best thing? Started working more in personal training and then found out about this thing called strength and conditioning, which is training athletes. And then went off to St. Mary's University in Twickenham to study that and started doing the usual stuff of doing work experience and all those kind of bits and bobs and really enjoyed working with youth athletes and thought there was real value there in getting them before they picked up bad habits and having a blank canvas and being able to really make the biggest amount of investment in youth athletes. So that's kind of what has led me on this path of working with youth athletes. So I've been coaching kids. I realized the other day, 20 years now. I'm across soccer coaching and training and conditioning. So it's been a long time across a lot of sports, everything from rugby union, rugby league, football, volleyball, swimming. Yeah, you name it. I've probably coached it at some point, whether it's just one athlete or a squad. And then I ended up at Scottish Rugby for 5 years. I've still never played a game of rugby union in my life, but ended up running 2 regional academies for Scottish Rugby, 3 junior national teams, and then I left 3 years ago to go full time into the private sector, where we coach athletes Monday to Friday after school from a whole lot of different sports, predominantly team sports, so mostly football and rugby, but then we have a few random ones thrown in there as well.
Yeah, and as a strength and conditioning coach, I feel like anybody that is younger and may have a dream of being a strength and conditioning coach, it's always get to the pros. What made it for you so interesting to kind of switch a little bit to the youth athletic development side?
I think as I started working more with youth athletes, I started coming across things that people weren't talking about when you're working with senior level athletes. Like, at uni, we talked about how to rehab people from a hamstring strain or an ACL, but we didn't talk about Osgood-Schlatter's. I was like, this is weird. I've never heard of that one. So I'm on Google looking at Osgood-Schlatter's or, Sever's disease. I haven't heard of that one either. I'll go and look up Sever's. And I suddenly realized this is different. There's a whole other world here that people aren't talking about because everyone's so obsessed with getting on Sky Sports, working in Manchester United or whatever it is. And all that happens is we have this really high churn of people coming straight out of uni, working with the academy for the minimum amount of time that they have to before they can graduate to the next level. And it's seen as this kind of like, you have to pay your dues and work with the 14, 15-year-olds before you're allowed to work with the 18-year-olds and then before you can work with the reserves in the first team. So it's kind of what I noticed was this conveyor belt of people who stayed in a job for a year or two and then moved up. And I realized what was happening is that you essentially have this cycle being repeated where people come in with a high level of theory, but not much practical experience. They make a lot of mistakes. They learn from those mistakes and they take that learning somewhere else. And then in comes a new person, steps into that role, makes all the same mistakes, takes it and learns somewhere else. So really the people that are suffering are the athletes themselves. And it kind of started making a light bulb in my head when I was like, man, I've got this athlete 18. I wish I had him at 16.
Yeah.
I've had such a head start. And then, I wish I got them at 14. Until it kind of went down and down. I was like, right, I want to be at the first point of entry so we can give these guys the best possible head start so that in 4 or 5 years' time, the coach that gets them goes, wow, you've already got such an awesome skill base. You understand how to move well. We don't have to worry about teaching you. We can just train now.
Hmm.
And I see that in the athletes that we coach when they graduate to other programs, they are far ahead of athletes who've been coached by suboptimal coaches, who just focused on getting really strong in a back squat, for example, but didn't bother to develop other movement skills.
Hmm.
And so now our athletes can take their toolbox wherever they go, because I don't know what the next coach is going to want. He might love Olympic lifts, he might hate them. He might love plyos, he might hate them. He might like med ball throws. So I'm like, let's get good at all this stuff, and then you can choose whatever tool you need in the future. But you've got it. You don't have to start from scratch.
Did you have experience as well earlier in your career with any of the higher level pro teams or just older athletes?
Yeah, so I was an intern at Watford Football Club for a little while, as a part-time kind of part-time intern 1 day a week. That was a while ago now. It would have been like, when was that? Probably 2010, 2011, somewhere around
Mhm.
there. I remember Jay Demerit was the captain, so that might be able to date it. Um, and did a bit with Harlequins Rugby League in their academy. Um, yeah, I'd done bits and pieces, and then I just kind of thought like, really, there's kind of two separate paradigms, is what I realized. That when you're at the senior elite level, you are preparing the squad to win
Mhm.
at the weekend or to win
Yeah.
the championship. And if your right back can't do the job, you will go out and find another right back that can. But when you're working with kids, it's really an individual development program. It's because this whole under 10 squad is not going to become the under 12 squad. It's,
Mhm.
it's not that team that's going to go all the way to the first team. It's select individuals that have developed individually to the level required. So it's really a separate process. One is about this team performance and can we get a result on the weekend? The other one is about this long-term development of that individual player to be the best they can possibly be.
Yeah, and I think what's cool about getting to work with the younger population is, like you said, you do sometimes in a lot of the instances just get a blank slate, and you essentially get to build and mold them into hopefully the rest of their athletic and
100%.
beyond that. I know that LTAD and everything is also not just about the sport, but about hopefully carrying on good practices throughout the rest of their life, because not every 13, 14-year-old is going to go on to play at a very high level of athletic prowess. But is there anything that you put into your program that might kind of convey this confidence building into these young kids and how they can use these principles further than just their athletic career?
Yeah, 100%. So this was something that probably surprised me actually when we started working in the private sector, because I really more had that physical kind of focus in mind.
Hmm.
And we're getting more and more parents kind of giving us testimonies and saying, "Oh man, their confidence has really improved, their self-esteem
Yeah.
skyrocketed." And I was like, "Okay, this is interesting." Like that was like I knew that happened, but I didn't think that would be like front and center of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
thing that they focused on. And one of the big, I guess, the thing that people might look at that we do and kind of just pass over and think, oh yeah, that's cool, but that's not like that big a deal. But actually, it is a huge deal. Is we every week we measure one element. So it could be
Hmm.
a standing broad jump, it could be a mid thigh pull, it could be height and weight. But we are always relating it back to their last one or to their previous best. So we are saying, Liam, last time you did this, you managed to jump 185. Can we jump 186 this time?
Hmm.
And so we're constantly focusing on little incremental gains, which really sends the message that you are evolving and improving. And if you're into psychology and the whole fixed and growth mindset, essentially that process is telling you if you turn up, work hard, you can get better.
Yeah.
And that, competence and confidence are hugely related. And that then shifts the whole situation from, oh, but Rob beat me because he jumped 2 meters. Well, don't worry about him. He's at
Yeah.
a different stage of his journey. And actually, he didn't get a personal best because his best is 205. So actually, today wasn't a good day for him.
Yeah.
But today was a great day for you because you put 1 centimeter on. So it's just this idea of individual improvement,
Hmm.
irrelevant of what other people are doing. And I see that spill over into other areas and that they realize, like, I can get better at stuff because
Yeah.
a lot of times kids come into our program and sometimes they're not the most gifted in maths or science or whatever. So they don't always get an opportunity to feel like that, but they get an opportunity to feel like that in our program every week.
Yeah, and I always end up hearing myself tell this to kids that, as long as you're one, consistent, two, work hard, and three, just follow general directions, like everybody will get better. That's the great thing about the gym. It's obviously there are skills involved, but they're all learned skills that everybody can essentially learn. It's not like, oh, you're good at football, you're not good at football. Yes, we can get incrementally better, but some are just never going to be great at football.
Yeah,
Um,
100%. And culture is huge for us in
yeah.
terms of I was really deliberate around like what's the behavior I want to reward? Like if I reward the person who does win everything, then we know
Hmm.
from LTD theory, I'm just rewarding the early maturer.
Yeah.
And that's probably actually not good for him because he thinks this is easy. I don't have to work for this.
Yep.
And the little guy at the back who's half a foot smaller, 20 kilograms less is never going to win anything and feel terrible about himself when actually he probably is a better bet long term. So what I specifically decided was the thing I want to reward is consistency.
Hmm.
Because when all the growth and maturation processes settle down, the person who has been the most consistent at turning up and putting in the work is the guy who will be the furthest ahead. Because it doesn't matter how gifted you are genetically, if you don't turn up for 6 months, you're probably going to get overtaken. And so we designed that into our culture where when kids get to 50 sessions, they get a t-shirt with a silver 50 on it. When they get to 100,
Hmm.
they get a hoodie with a gold 100. So we are celebrating these milestones, which, as you said, anyone can achieve. You just have to keep turning up.
Yeah.
Keep turning up, putting in the work, you'll achieve this. So instead of rewarding, oh, you're the best at this or you're the best at that, I'm rewarding, are you turning up and working hard? And when you beat your own personal best, we will celebrate that with you. So it's really all down to you, how far you
Yeah.
want to go.
How do you balance kind of the fine line between we obviously want to create a competitive-ish environment so that they're pushing themselves and working hard, but at the same times, not necessarily, like you said, comparing themselves to their peers who might be, 6 months ahead of them or in a growth and maturation aspect further along that development line? How do you kind of walk that fine line between still keeping it competitive and having them work hard, but also not comparing?
I think when you understand growth and maturation, you can start to pick the ones that you are going to focus on. So for us, we use a standing broad jump, and this is interesting because not many people around the world do this. So we're quite unique in this element, and we scale it relative to height.
Okay.
So what we find is actually there are certain ratios. If you can jump your height, it's pretty good. It's all right. It's
Hmm.
not amazing. But if you can jump 1.2 times your height, now we're really talking.
Yeah.
About 1.5 times your height, now we're looking at some serious numbers. And that doesn't matter if you're 6 foot or 5 foot because it's relevant to you. So
Yeah.
we start to get these equalizers. So the same thing with a mid-thigh pull when we relate it to body weight, because in a roundabout way, that's kind of accounting for the growth and maturation process because we know peak height velocity happens and peak weight velocity. So now we can compare two 14-year-olds who are vastly different in stature and
Hmm.
body weight by the same metric and saying, actually, yeah, you pulled 150 kilos in the mid-thigh pull. He pulled 70, but actually he's pulling 2.5 times his body
Yeah.
weight or whatever it is. He's actually stronger than you. It just doesn't look like it on the dial because you
Hmm.
pulled a bigger absolute number, but pound for pound, he's stronger than you are. So we
Yeah.
start to like level the playing field a little bit. And the kids really like that because I have a number of people who come in and they're the older ones and they're like, oh yeah, I pulled 200. I'm like, yeah, but you weigh 100. He weighs
Hmm.
50 and he pulled 150. So he's pulled 3 times his body weight. He's actually stronger than you. And you
Yeah.
suddenly see the lights go on and they're like, oh, I got to try harder.
Yeah.
So it's a really good equalizer.
And you touched on a couple of them already, but what are a brand new kids coming into your facility? What are some of the baseline testing things that you're doing? And you talked about every week you pick a new one to retest, but what are some of just the general tests that you're doing with them?
Yeah, so when someone comes into our program, we at first do a one-to-one with them to walk them through how our
Hmm.
system and our sessions work. But we get their baseline data. So we'll get height, weight, and we'll get a standing broad jump, a mid-thigh pull, an anterior sort of plank, a lateral plank. I think what else? A counter movement jump, and potentially an RSI measure as well. So we kind
Hmm.
of get like, here's where we're starting from,
Yeah.
which really then allows us to have that process of, hey, you got better every week. And then we'll just rotate through those tests. So we have sort of had 8 weeks that we rotate through. So we'll do a height and weight, standing broad jump, mid thigh pull, counter movement jump, front plank, um, RSI, side plank, and then we go back to the start and we start again. So we basically ticking these off sort of every 6 to 7 weeks, which
Hmm.
is long enough for someone to actually get better at something, even if it's
Yeah.
marginally. But also with this population, it's inevitable that someone's off sick that month
Yeah.
because they got something from school or they got to visit granny or whatever it is. So having that micro dosing of testing for us is far more effective than going, okay, we are going to test everything on this one day because I know I've seen it enough times now that you
Hmm.
will miss people on that one day and have no data for them whatsoever. So I'd rather have 3 out of 4 pieces every month than one individual who missed everything.
Yeah. How do you go about more of the strength side of testing? Because obviously, with a brand new athlete, even with any of our young athletes, 1RMs are most likely not the best case of action. So, how do you go about testing? Obviously, maybe upper body strength, you can do things like pull ups, push ups, things like that, but especially lower body, how do you go about that?
So we only, in terms of our regular testing battery, we just use an isometric mid-thigh pull. So
Okay.
we have a unit from Tyndek that goes up to 500 kilos. And it's obviously self-regulated in that you just pull how hard you can. So it's
Yep.
not like a bench press or a back squat where we're loading more and more and more
Yep.
until you hit failure. So that works really well. And it's really quick and easy to do. We've kind of come, I think we've now come hopefully to our final sort of setup that makes it really easy to adjust in between. And I very deliberately, when I do it, I will start with the tallest person and go down to the shortest, because then we're just going in one direction. We don't have to go
Yep.
backwards or forward. So it's just getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Mm-hmm.
That works really well. At the end of our foundation phase, where our objective is primarily movement competency,
Mm-hmm.
then we will utilize a modified version of the Australian strength and conditioning test that Dan Baker produced. And the whole idea of that test is to really see if people are ready to get under a barbell and start a traditional loading program.
Mm-hmm.
So from memory, the original test is like push-ups in 60 seconds, squats with 20% of your body weight held at the chest, like a goblet squat.
Mm-hmm.
Again, maximum reps in 60 seconds. A front hover hold, so a front straight arm plank,
Mm-hmm.
twisting sit up, and then a pistol on the right and left leg. But we've kind of modified things because I realized there's certain, when you create the constraints for something, you can end up realizing that you're rewarding the wrong behavior. So actually,
Yep.
I realized that by rewarding maximum reps in 60 seconds, I'm actually getting poor movement quality.
Yep.
So what we did is we did it to a metronome. So we do it at 30 beats per minute now. So I'm getting solid quality, smooth movement. We moved away from a rotating sit up because I was like, this doesn't really tell me much. The quality varies massively from
Mm-hmm.
athlete to athlete. Some are doing a full
Yep.
rotation, some are just banging them out. So we actually changed that to the side plank because I was like, that tells me a bit more about your lateral bracing ability.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty easy to uniform, like standardize that across people. So the quality control is better. Chin-ups is another one that's in there, pistols that are in there. So we still have, I guess we've stayed true to the idea of that test, but we've modified it a bit more to make it more stringent, I would say.
Got you. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah. And we
Yeah.
find that if people have been through our system and they have come through all the movement variations that we do in that foundation program, they usually blitz that test
Mm-hmm.
unless they've gone through a real recent period of growth or had some sort of, injuries or mobility issues, etc.
Yeah, it's funny. I literally just downloaded like a metronome app a couple weeks ago
Yeah.
just because I did do a push-up test and some kids just bang out as quickly as they can. And I'm like, the
Yeah.
quality on those is terrible.
We actually use a hands-off press up for that because you know what it's like.
Yeah.
Some are doing half reps, some are
Yeah.
doing, because what usually happens is in any sort of test that you time it is that you end up punishing the one who's doing it the best.
The best. Yeah.
And I'm like, this is upside down. I want to reward
Yeah.
that kid. So I'm like, how do I make this the most stringent? I'm like, right, we're all going to take a hands off at the bottom of every
Yep.
press up because I know you're not cheating now.
Yep. You
I
gotta
don't
go
need
all
to
the way
measure
down.
anything. Exactly, yeah. And if you don't, you're going to end up slamming your chest into the ground if you take your hands off and you're not there. So yeah, we did that to kind of modify it a bit more.
I heard you mention moving on from, say, a foundational phase. Two questions. One, do you have, like you mentioned, maybe a little bit of a checklist of what they have to accomplish? Is that what you already talked about with the Australian test? And then, if so, what are the next phases that you move into?
Yeah, so we kind of borrowed this probably from, I mean, I'm a bit of a magpie and I always look at, I like this bit from that system and this bit from
Yeah.
that system. So it's very much a conjugate kind of style
Yeah.
program where I've pitched a bit from James Baker and a bit from Dan Baker and a bit from other people. Um, so we have a movement curriculum. We've got 2 sessions per week, and it's 12 levels. And what we do in that initial assessment where we pull someone in for that one-to-one with the coaches, as well as collecting their baseline data, we're kind of figuring out, right, where are you starting in this curriculum?
Mm-hmm.
You zero training experience, can't hinge, very low levels of strength, so you're starting on level 1, or are you pretty well developed? Maybe you did some gymnastics as a kid, you move pretty well, starting at level 6. Because as you well know, if things are too easy, it's going to be boring for the kid, and that's when they're going to start acting up
Yeah.
because I'm not actually working that hard. I'm a bit bored,
Mm-hmm.
or it's so challenging, I can't complete anything, and now I'm demotivated and I don't want to do it. So we're
Yeah.
trying to get that sweet spot of challenge. And then essentially what we do is we will spend a month working through that variation and then we'll graduate. So we do it quite linearly. And essentially my idea or my thought process in that phase is all about movement competency. So I don't care how much load you're lifting. I want
Mm-hmm.
the right load for good quality movement. So we look at it, for example, if it's a compound movement, so maybe it's a squat, a hinge, or a push or pull, we're going to start on 3 sets of 6 repetitions. which is low on purpose because I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to be going into fatigue, because we know fatigue corrupts movement quality.
Mm-hmm.
And then each week, I'm just going to give you 2 more repetitions of practice. So I'm not looking at it as in like, oh, we're building hypertrophy, we're building work capacity. I'm just giving you more practice of the skill I want you to get good at. And then when we get to 3 sets of 12, we are going to come in, change the program, but we're going to drop back to 3 sets of 6 because it's a new movement. But I'm coming in and I'm messing with some element of that movement. So if you're familiar with a bit of Franz Bosch, he's much smarter than me, but the idea of fluctuators and attractors.
Yeah.
So in my head, I'm like, right, what are the attractors of a good squatting pattern? And it's, for me, it's pretty much 3 things. If your heels stay flat, your knees stay out, and your chest stays up, 90% of the time, regardless of what the squat is, overhead, front, back, goblet squat, that's a pretty good squat.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, what in my head process is, these athletes going through this month, they're learning to organize their body in space in that movement or that variation of the movement. And they've kind of solidified, okay, cool, I can organize my body in space in these shapes. And then we're like, cool, that's really stable. I'm going to come and mess with that now. So instead of it being a symmetrical load and a goblet squat, we're now going to have you hold a kettlebell off to one side.
Yeah.
Can you reorganize your body in space? Cool. Now you can now, and we're gradually just increasing the complexity of this movement. So for me, the key variable in the foundation phase is complexity.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll start from, for example, if we just take our squatting stream, our first squat is a body weight partial squat to a box or a bench. So limited range of motion, limited complexity, like small joint angles. Our last variation is a barbell back squat.
Yeah.
So you've got a 2-meter long bar, 20
Yep.
kilos posterior loaded that I've got organized through a full range of motion. It's more complex.
Mm-hmm.
So all we're doing is taking you through this journey of learning to organize your body in space in this shape through various different implements, different ranges of motions, different loading, anterior, posterior, overhead, so that by the end of this 12-month period, you don't just understand one variation of squatting like a back squat. You understand this language of squatting, and you can take whichever variation you want. And we have the same sort of process for pushing, pulling, lunging, etc.
Got you. How do you explain this kind of, obviously the kids are there doing it, so it's much easier for them to grasp, but how do you explain this and slash your philosophy to, say, parents?
So for me, I just relate everything back to school.
Yeah.
So coming back to kind of what we talked about the conveyor belt, a friend of mine, an Olympian, Jared Deacon, who's at the Sydney 2000 Olympics, excellent S&C coach. He's an ex-PE teacher, and he pointed out to me, no one has this paradigm in education. Like in education, we understand a primary school teacher, that's their specialism. Secondary school teacher, that's their specialism. We'd never say to a primary school teacher, why are you wasting your time with the kids? Why don't you go to teach in high school?
Yeah.
But we do that in sport. And it flags up the idea that in sport, we haven't caught on yet that it's a specialism to work with a particular sort of age and stage. So what I do with parents is say, basically, when your kid learns English, they learn the alphabet first, right? They learn words, and then they put those words together in sentences. It would be stupid for me to start teaching your kids saying, right, we're going to write an essay on multiculturalism or whatever it is, because they haven't learned the alphabet. This is like crazy, but that's what we do in sport. We're like, we want this super high sport specific program. I'm like, your kid can't lunge. They don't need a sport specific program. They need to learn the alphabet. So that's what we're doing here at this point in time in the foundation phase, is you are learning the alphabet of moving, and the alphabet in our context is squatting, pushing, pulling, jumping, landing, hopping, bracing, rotating. That's what we're doing. So it's really about building this toolbox of skills that they will take anywhere from here. The next phase, the development phase, where we really focus on relative strength, we're now going to choose a more limited range of those tools that we are then going to get really strong in. So I'm teaching you the alphabet. We're now sort of building words and sentences as we're kind of upgrading. It would be silly to start teaching someone algebra on day one if they couldn't count to 10. That's what we're doing. It's foundational. So we understand this in other contexts, school, whether it's maths or English or whatever. That's all we're doing. People need to start looking at training in the same way of like, we're at this end of the spectrum. We're not at the elite senior performance end where we're trying to get them super sport specific gains for the weekend. This is like, we got 10 to 20 years. I'm not in a rush. We can learn and build all these things and then gradually emphasize what we want as we move on.
Do you ever, and I don't know if you work with any athletes like this, but for sports that maybe are a little bit more early specialized or like, gymnastics, even swimming, I was just watching US trials. There's 14 and 15-year-olds essentially competing for the Olympics. For this, I find it sometimes hard to explain to a parent that we're still essentially
Mm.
general strength and conditioning because in their sport, they're competing at, possibly the best that they could compete at.
Yeah, I think this kind of comes down to the idea of like training age. So
Yeah.
like when I said, yeah, that's awesome. You've been training swimming for 10 years. How long have you been training in the gym? Okay. So although in one domain you might be
Yeah.
really advanced, in this domain you're actually a beginner.
Yeah.
And so we don't need to do the advanced stuff yet because the beginning stuff will work. And let's save that advanced stuff when the beginning stuff stops working.
Hmm.
And then we can move on. Just because you're really advanced at one particular domain doesn't mean you're advanced at another one.
Yeah. And I think it also is important for them to realize that essentially by taking this more of a slow cooked approach, hopefully the athlete can continue to get better, continue to get stronger. We're not gonna,
Yeah.
essentially burn them out too early where they're getting to 20 years old and they're already kind of past their prime.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is one of the issues you have. And I realized, like, I think about this a lot. Um, the problem we have with a lot of sort of degree programs and sports science degrees and stuff is that a lot of them are built around understanding and evaluating training methods that are made for elite performers and
Hmm.
senior performers. So like we might talk about like high intensity plyometrics or using velocity based training or overcoming accommodating resistance, for example, like bands and
Yeah.
chains. And then you see people graduate those programs, but they don't work with elite performers. They work with kids,
Yeah.
but they bring those elite training methodologies to the kids. I'm like, you don't need bands and chains. You don't need VBT. You don't need any of that. Because the flip side to this is if you use that now, that's a tool you don't have 10 years down the line
Exactly.
because you've squeezed that lemon already. So actually, we want, people talk about the minimal effective dose of an exercise, but I think people also need to think about the minimal effective exercise.
Yeah.
I don't need to be doing German volume training with a 15-year-old. Like they just started last week. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, let's
Yeah.
take this slow and steady approach. So I think people need to recognize where they are in the talent development process and realize, oh, I'm training this person. They might be advanced at football or basketball, but in the terms of training, they're a beginner. And so we,
Hmm.
we need beginner methods.
Unfortunately, I find, especially with the access to social media and things like that, even kids now, they see
Mm.
so many things online. They'll see their favorite footballer, their favorite athlete doing some exercise in their training and immediately won't think, oh, that must be the best way to increase my vertical or to get more powerful or anything like that. And then they come in essentially thinking, oh, we're not doing those. We must not be doing what's best. And then
Yeah.
trying to have that conversation with them. Again, that comes down to coaching and communication, but having that conversation with them to sit them down and say, look, at your stage of your development, your training age, this is what we can do to best help you right now. Later on, we can get to some more quote unquote cooler things or more advanced things, but right now, this is what's going to be best for you.
Yeah, I think I remember listening to a podcast where someone was interviewing Mike Boyle about this question. And
Hmm.
he said, like, when a parent says, is your program like baseball specific or ice hockey specific? And you say, well, that depends. Does your son or daughter need to jump higher? Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay. Do they need to sprint faster? Yeah. Do they need to get stronger? Yeah. Well, it's specific to that,
Yeah.
which I thought was a really great answer because it's kind of answering the question, but in a roundabout way, kind of saying, well, this is still the right thing.
Exactly. Just developing athletic qualities all around.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh, on the other, so we talked about a lot essentially about the performance kind of side of things, but on the injury side, especially with youth athletes, and you already mentioned a little bit of Osgood-Schlatters and severs and things like that. Are you seeing a lot of that in your youth athletes? And considering you've been in the field for 20 years, like you said, has it gotten any worse, any better, stayed the same? What's your kind of views on this?
I would say yes and no. We do and don't see it. It's funny. I find that those people who kind of start training before
Hmm.
maturation or before that process seem to sort of manage to avoid that. And I think it's because we're strengthening the other areas that typically are weak links in
Hmm.
athletes that develop Osgood-Schlatters, for example. So just to kind of elaborate on that, like if you are undertaking a really high running load and there's a lot of force going through your patellar tendon, for example, that's maybe be there because some of the surrounding musculature isn't picking up the slack because you
Hmm.
haven't developed the force abilities of those muscles, then you see a big sort of like flare up of that. So we tend to see people coming into our program when they first come, they might have these issues and then
Hmm.
it clears up. It's rare that we see people already in our program developing it, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. So often it will be people come to us because they've got Osgood-Schlatters or severs, but people in our program typically don't develop it.
Yeah.
which is an interesting, it's anecdotal. I don't have any research to
Yeah.
back that up, but it's just what I see. But in terms of like, what are the key things? Like, load is a huge thing. I think people don't really think about how your load capacity potentially changes as your skeleton is changing.
Hmm.
And yeah, you might have been able to run 10, 15 Ks a week this time last year, but something's happening in your system that's reduced your capacity. So 10 to 15 Ks a week, this year is actually too much for you.
Hmm.
Because really, any injury, when you think about it, is just we've gone past the threshold of what that area of the body is capable
Yeah.
of standing, whether that's a tendon, a ligament, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it could be acute in terms of an initial injury, or it could be chronic. And with these like severs and osgood ladders, or tibial apophysitis, whatever you want to use the proper names, it's all we've withstanded the threshold that tissue can handle. And
Hmm.
so we need to back off on that. And we then probably need to look at, well, how can we improve the ability of the surrounding muscles to help in their contribution of absorbing that force or distributing
Hmm.
that force. And it's usually what you usually find, like listening to Angela Jackson recently in the LTD network, like you've got a big, powerful tendon pulling on a really soft bit of bone
Yeah.
that's soft because that's where new growth is coming from. So it
Hmm.
makes sense that if an athlete is doing more and more work and that tendon's yanking on this bone more and more frequently, that eventually you get to a point where like that's really painful and swollen and irritated. I don't want to sprint much, or I don't want
Yeah.
to jump much, or I
Yeah.
don't want to turn much. Like it makes sense. So what do? Let's back off on some of those actions that cause really powerful forces through that part. Doesn't mean we have to stop and sit on the couch and do nothing.
Yeah.
It needs to be a bit smarter. So in football, the typical sort of scenario that I will say to parents is, listen, like imagine a rondo drill. There's two sort of roles in a rondo drill. You're either the player in the middle running around trying to intercept the ball, or you're the player on the outside who's passing the ball.
Hmm.
Now, of those two roles, the one in the middle is really going to exacerbate your Osgood Schlatters or your severs because there's lots of sprinting, there's accelerating, decelerating, changing direction. Player on the outside, that's pretty much fine, right? So I can still get technical development. I can still engage in a session. I just need to be smart about what roles I'm choosing.
Hmm.
And there's also an element for coaches in that as well to say, okay, I understand that loading or high force actions are the issues. In this drill, you're going to be this sort of player, or you're going to be a bounce player, or like we're going to use you slightly differently.
Hmm.
I don't want you sprinting up and down the length of the pitch every 5 minutes.
Yeah. It's about finding ways that they can still be involved, still get something. If they have a lower limb injury, can still train either the other limb or the upper body or
100%.
core, anything
Yeah.
like
And
that.
David Johnson's got some great research on that in terms of how they adapted training at Bournemouth around
Hmm.
players with low status and kept them available.
Yeah.
I think it just comes down to that attitude. The big one is what can we do rather than what can't we do? Because people typically focus
Yeah.
on, oh, I can't do this, I can't do that. The physio said this, or doctor said that. I'm like, okay, we're focusing on all the things
Great.
we
Yeah.
can't do. What can we do? We can make real gains in other areas at this point in time.
Yeah. And you mentioned you have athletes, typically ones that in anecdotally don't experience this are ones that come to you earlier. For the age-old question for any parents that might be listening, thinking, what's a good age? When can my son or daughter start a strength and conditioning program? What's your answer for that?
Yeah, I mean, this for me, this really depends. It's a big it depends question because first of all, it depends what you mean by strength and conditioning. Is
Hmm.
that a formal like gym program, or is that press ups, jumping,
Hmm.
landing? Because you could look at gymnastics when kids are 4 and say, well, that looks an awful lot like strength
Yeah.
and conditioning to me. It's just framed differently, right?
Yeah.
So really, it's when they can follow instructions and concentrate and operate safely in that environment. That's what I say to parents. So for us, in our environment, which incorporates kind of a traditional gym environment, I typically say 10 as a
Yeah.
ballpark figure. Sometimes you get some outstanding 9-year-olds that are really clued on
Hmm.
and can follow instructions. But if I was in a different environment, say I was, I don't know, in somewhere that was really matted and we were doing lots of animal shapes and movements and rolling and ninja stuff, I
Yeah.
would still class that as S&C. It just looks different. And we
Yeah.
could do that at 5, 6, 7, 8. So
Yeah.
it really depends on the environment, I would say, that you're in. From a safety element of like, are you going to be running into a barbell, or is it a padded room where you can pretty much do yourself no harm?
Yeah.
But ultimately, it comes down to can they operate safely in the environment that we're in?
And I think also, like you said, listen to instructions, because as long as they can listen, and hopefully we can keep them safe, because at the end of the day, that is
Yeah,
the biggest thing we're worried about. And I think
100%.
there was somebody, kind of, I wouldn't say new, but new to me in the last few months that I've even seen on social media and whatnot. I think he's in the UK, and he looks like he has that exact environment where it's just all pads, all matted, and he can do, a lot of spatial awareness, body awareness, things like that. Almost that looks like gymnastics, and that. If you have the space for it, yeah, you can, essentially start whenever the kid can listen to some instructions or is willing and able to.
Yeah, yeah, totally. It at the end of the day, it's making it appropriate to like the age of the child that you're working with, right? Or the
Hmm.
stage. Like when I was briefly at Wolverhampton Wanderers, and we would go and do like animal movements with the kids in the warm up.
Yeah.
Now the kids didn't know what we were doing, but we're
Hmm.
teaching them jumping and landing every time you're doing a kangaroo. I'm teaching them like bracing and upper body strength every time we're crawling like a lizard. Like just because I didn't say 3 sets of 10 back squat doesn't mean it's not
Yeah.
strength conditioning.
Yeah. And would you have kind of woven some of those things in if you were, because I know you said you also coached, the sport, woven those in, whether it be the warm up or sprints or anything like that? How did you kind of handle that on field, in season style strength and conditioning for these young athletes?
Yeah, 100%. I think this is where, like when people start thinking like isolationist and think, oh, this is the rugby training and that
Hmm.
is the S&C training, or this is football and that's, prehab.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's all the same, right? Like your brain doesn't know that you're
Yep.
playing football versus lifting a weight. Your brain just knows we have to do this task. So, I mean, often I'll have coaches say, oh, I don't have time to do any strength and conditioning. And I'm like, I guarantee you have time in your warm up. If your players are turning up and they're doing the crossbar challenge for 10 minutes,
Hmm.
or it's like skills school and we're all going to stand around in a circle and do around the world. Like we could grab 10 minutes there, do some really good quality S&C that is in your warm up. You do that 2 or 3 times a week. We've just grabbed 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be a full session. It could be that one day we're doing some squatting and hinging and jumping. The other day we're doing some bracing and pushing. And we just weave it into the warm up. But there's no reason why you can't do that on pitch. One of the greatest coaching experiences I had that probably challenged me the most was working in inner city London with a basketball program where we had no equipment. Everything was on court. It was just me, and there was about 20 or 30 players at the time. I
Hmm.
really learned there how to keep
Yep.
things progressing over 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, because everything was on court. Like
Yeah.
we didn't have any tools.
How do you approach? Because I've also had instances where a parent may come and they want to, or they think that they want to just develop, core strength or one isolated area. Obviously, we want more of a holistic program, but if you go into just answering the core strength question, how would you approach that?
Yeah, I think it probably. I always try and relate things back to the sport. So,
Hmm.
like in the case of football, I'll be like, yeah, you're right. That really is really important. But it's also important to be strong when we decelerate. Like
Hmm.
if you think about, and there's, you can pull out people who've got injured jumping and landing incorrectly, or
Yeah.
talk about actually helping apply force to the ground. It's going to make you jump higher. Would jumping higher be beneficial? Or sprinting faster be beneficial? So for me, relating it back to the sport, because that's ultimately the reason they come to you is to
Hmm.
get better at the sport. So if you can pull out these things and say, actually, if we work on lower body strength, we might also get gains in speed or
Hmm.
gains in power. And like, is that also of interest? Probably, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, being able to tie it back to the sport and tie it back almost to specific actions in the sport, I find really helps because it's often obvious to us as S&C coaches, but it's not obvious to the onlooker because they're like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, but you don't need to be strong in football because it's all with your body weight. It's like, yeah, but gravity is 9.8 meters per second. If I want to overcome gravity to jump higher, I've got to be pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Um, so like being able to pull out things and say, well, actually, this is how that's going to help. Then you then find people go, oh, okay, like I didn't realize that.
Yeah, exactly. What data are you collecting? And slash, how are you kind of using this either with the athletes or to convey to parents?
So we are collecting those tests that we mentioned, sort of a battery of sort of every eight
Hmm.
weeks. Because of the constraints of our facility, we don't always get a chance to do like speed
Yeah.
testing
Yeah.
because we may not necessarily have enough of a runoff either side,
Hmm.
so that kids aren't running into a wall, for example. So we'll collect that data when we can. And then every 3 months, we basically give parents the opportunity to sit down for 30 minutes and go through that data and say,
Gotcha.
this is where little Johnny started the program. He's grown 5 centimeters. He's put on 3 kilos. His
Hmm.
jump's gone up by 20 centimeters. His mid thigh pull's gone up by 20 kilos. And we can demonstrate progress basically. Because I think one of the ways people who aren't really appropriate for this industry get away with sticking around for so long is they're not accountable to the parent in a
Yeah.
black and white manner. they can say, oh, like he looks so much better, or oh, I can see he's doing this or he's doing that. And I'm like, okay, but that's not objective. That's just your
Hmm.
opinion. And it's easy to hide behind that. Like,
Yeah.
oh, he's really confident. Okay, but are you actually making it better? And there's a lot of people in our industry that will make kids sweaty and tired, but they're not actually making them better.
Hmm.
And most people don't realize through the process of maturation, you can get better at most things anyway. Your
Yeah.
speed's going to go up, your strength's going to go up. So actually, you can do nothing and get better. So just because you're doing something doesn't mean you're any good as a coach. So being able to present back objective data around how their strength has changed, how their power has changed, how their endurance has changed, how their speed has changed. It's then like there's no argument, right? They got
Yeah.
better. What then happens is that parent was to leave us and go to another program of someone who isn't as transparent. Their expectations are now different
Hmm.
because they're like, well, hang on, at this other place, we used to get this opportunity to go through this data. Where's the data? Oh, there isn't
Hmm.
any data. Okay, well, how do I know you're really good at what you do?
Yeah.
Like, so there's an education piece, I think, as well, which creates more educated customers going forward, which will raise the expectation.
Yeah. How big are your training groups on average?
So we keep it small on purpose. So we have a maximum capacity of 12.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, I always say to parents, it's not like PE where they're like
Yeah.
hanging from the rafters or anything like that. Like
Hmm.
this is a high quality program, and we want that to be the case. And we want to keep it that way. So yeah, I mean, we offer 15 sessions a week, so 3 after school every day, Monday to Friday. And our members basically they can pick and choose. So they've got
Hmm.
the opportunity to create a reservation if they can only have a train on a Tuesday and a Thursday at 4:30, then we
Hmm.
can lock that in for them. But if they
Yeah.
want to chop and change, they can do. So some sessions, like a Friday, is typically quite quiet. Could be anywhere from 3 to 5 in a session. There'll be sessions today that are like 10, 11, 12. So yeah, and we, depending on the group, we might choose to split them sort of 50-50 and
Yeah.
sort of stagger
I
how
was
we do our
guess.
sessions. So
So do you get sometimes some, lower training age kids with some higher training age kids, and how do you approach that?
yeah, so this is something I've again has been intentional on my part, and it was interesting because recently I had a parent question on this, and I was like, well, this is actually not
Actually.
this is not a mistake. This is done on purpose. So one of the things I think we do in sport and schooling with kids that's pretty artificial is we always combine them with kids their age,
Hmm.
which is weird when you think about it because that doesn't happen in any other walk of life. You go after a job, you'll be working with people who are 20 years older than you, 30 years older than you, 5 years younger than like this ability to communicate up and down ages is
Hmm.
actually something that's required later in life. But also the ability to communicate with people who are maybe from a different sport, like
Yeah.
experiencing different things.
Hmm.
So I actually have kind of stolen this from martial arts, where martial arts is a bit different because you could be a black belt and train with a white belt. You
Yeah.
could be, it's done differently. You could be in a session and you're training with someone at a different ability level. And I wanted to utilize that because I think there's something useful in that where there's an opportunity for you to be a role model to someone slightly further
Yeah.
behind and someone else to be a role model to you. So there's
Hmm.
also this intangible element of developing your leadership skills and
Hmm.
your confidence in saying, Lewis, you did a front squat last month. Can you show Simon how to front squat? Because
Yeah.
you know this. So
Hmm.
I give you the opportunity to be like, oh, I've got some expertise here. I've got competence. So we purposely have mixed age and mixed ability sessions because I want to create that. And if you look into the biobanding research, there's some good psychological responses that happen there where people get to form those roles that don't normally get to
Hmm.
do it. So we, in our sort of foundation program, in our 12 levels, it's color coded from
Yeah.
white to black, stolen from martial arts. So you start as a white belt, you end as a black belt.
Yeah.
And then our development program, they're kind of following a similar program. So depending on the makeup of any one group at any one time, we might choose to split it, where the development group might go on their own and the foundation guys might be together, or you get siblings and those two guys don't work well together, let's split them up. So
Yeah.
it could be different depending on the session, the day you look at, based on
Yeah.
who's in that group. But one of the key things is there will be people of different training ages, different stages, different chronological
Hmm.
ages in the same session, and it's done on purpose.
Yeah, and I think it's honestly one of the most rewarding feelings, even as a coach, to see an older or even just a more experienced athlete take a younger or newer athlete through a lift, and like you said, teach them how to front squat or anything like that. Because also it means hopefully you're doing something right if you can teach something well enough that somebody else can then teach it too.
100%. Like for me, I would consider our program a huge failure if an athlete leaves, goes into a local gym and has no idea what they're doing.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want this to, I often say this to athletes, like, this isn't my program. This is your program. It's
Hmm.
something we're doing together. So I don't want mindless zombies who are just doing 3 sets of 10 bench press.
Yeah.
And then in 6 months' time, they don't know anything about training. They don't know
Yeah.
anything about progressive overload or why we've changed the reps or the load
Hmm.
or,
Yeah.
I want them, as well as having the physical skills, to have the mental skills. Because really, I have an ulterior motive. Like, yes, it's awesome if people go and play professional sport. But even Cristiano Ronaldo, one day,
Is
eventually,
is
will
gonna.
decide to hang up his boots and will
Yeah.
not be playing professional level sport. So we all go back to being a normie eventually. And
Yeah.
when we do, we all need the same things. We need to eat well, sleep well, and train well.
Yeah.
So that's true for all of us. So I need you, when you go off to university and we're not there, to be able to do those things.
Yeah.
So it's an educational program as well as a physical development program.
Yeah, exactly. And I know we're both short on time, so the last question, um, are there any misconceptions out there that you hear a lot about that you want to maybe address?
Thousands. I don't know if we've got enough time for all
Maybe
of
we
them.
could pick a couple,
Yeah,
but
yeah. The 10,000 hour rule is a massive misconception that a lot of long-term athlete development is based upon. It was
Hmm.
never meant to be interpreted that way by that researcher. And he
Hmm.
has put editorial posts out there to say, actually, like, just because this was music doesn't mean you can transfer over to sprinting,
Yeah.
because it's different, because there's a more physical component.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of misconceptions around that, because people have then chopped up 10,000 hours into, well, if you do 4 hours a day for this many years, like, that's not how it
Yeah.
works.
Hmm.
And so that's one big one. The other big one is around, sort of, we kind of touched on this, like, what's the right age to start training? And in
Hmm.
the UK, it's usually 16 or 18 is the one that comes up. And if you start asking why, basically the answer you get is because people won't insure a gym to train people younger.
Yeah.
So it's not based on biology
Yeah.
or human development, it's based on insurance. Essentially, our body adapts to training in different ways, neurally, hormonally, in our musculoskeletal system. And actually, we will adapt to training across our entire lifespan.
Hmm.
It's just maybe there's a bigger emphasis on neural development when we don't have a big surplus of testosterone, or maybe
Yeah.
there's a big element on hormonal changes when we suddenly get that big increase in growth hormone. But we can all improve and develop our movement skills, our strength, our power, our speed. In fact, it's almost the inverse of what people think, where people are like, oh no, wait till you're 18. I'm like, actually, this is like the prime time. You
Yeah.
you basically get nature giving you performance enhancing drugs. Like, this is the best time to train, because we're going to give you such a head start that people won't be able to catch you up. So usually, stuff around loading, stunting growth. If you look at the research, the way to break a growth plate is a massive collision with something,
Hmm.
like another human being, concrete, a
Yeah.
tree. Like, the research on fracturing growth plates is usually done by really high impact collisions. So we're scared of that happening in the gym somehow, yet we don't mind it happening on,
Yeah.
the rugby pitch or the football pitch, or, like, people
Yeah.
break arms and legs on sports grounds every day of the week, and
Yeah.
we kind of accept that as like, oh, that's just sport.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's a bit of a back to front risk reward scenario. So that fear is really unfounded and incredibly unlikely. So we're kind of shying away from the thing that could be the most beneficial for us based on
Yeah.
some of these
I was
underlying
gonna say
fears.
when you look at like the incidence of injury in almost every sport and then compare it to the gym, it's shocking that
Yeah,
people are
like,
so scared.
so complete transparency. We've Last week we had the most injuries we've ever had, which was 2 ankle sprains, and
Hmm.
that's across the last 3 years of training
Yeah.
kids 5 days a week.
Yeah.
So I bet if you asked any sports coach over the last
Yeah.
3 years how many injuries they've had, it'd be a heck of a lot more than 2 ankle sprains. And that was bizarrely two athletes, instead of jumping over the hurdle, they landed on top of the hurdle.
Yeah.
Just freak that it happened in the same week. It hasn't
Yeah.
happened before or since. So, and it's like, in 3 years, hey, I'll take that. Two
Yeah.
twisted ankles. In terms of
Well,
sports injuries, that's pretty low level.
yeah. Well, anyway, thank you so much for giving up some of your time to do this. Before you leave, is there anywhere you want to point people towards either getting in contact with you or hearing more about what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So if people are like coaches and want to learn more about this stuff, I've teamed up with Dan Howells from Collaborate Sports, who's ex English Institute of Sport and GB7's S&C coach. We're running an LTAD mentorship, so people can jump on and learn more about kind of putting this stuff into real life.
Hmm.
So you can head to Collaborate Sports to find out more about that. If you want to check us out on social media, you can see the day-to-day coaching of youth athletes. If you just look on Instagram, it's it's at underscore the athlete academy, or you can just go to theathleteacademy.uk and you can see basically what we do. We don't have any secrets. We put it all out there. You'll see you'll see what we're doing in a session tonight or last week or
Mhm.
whatever, and maybe get some ideas from there as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Not a problem. Thanks for your time.